I want to just go ahead and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the middle of your workday. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. On behalf of our entire board and staff, we're just really thrilled that you're wanted to spend your lunch with us and learn more about FWC's Panther work. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. I'm going to ask everyone to please stay muted during the conversation. If you have a question that comes up and you want to make sure you don't forget it, feel free to drop it in the chat and I can ask it for you during the Q&A session. Or if you'd prefer to ask it yourself, hold on to it, raise your hand virtually during that session and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute and you can talk directly to the biologist. Speaking of our presenters today, I'll give you a quick introduction. We have Dave Honorato, he's FWC's lead on the Panther research team. We have Hollis Stewart, who's FWC's Panther vet, and Andy Walker, who's the foundation's president and CEO. So Andy, I'm gonna hand it over to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. This is a great number of people to show up for this call. Panthers bring out the best in us, I think, and all of you have supported this program in one way or another, and we are so grateful that you have. We have 5 initiatives here at the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and conserving Florida's iconic wildlife is one of those 5 initiatives. And it includes everything from indigo snakes to Florida black bears to manatee sea turtles, but certainly above and beyond the Florida panther. And today's webinar, we'll talk about some of the issues around panthers right now. But by and large, and I'm sure Dave and Hollis are going to speak to this, the panther story is one of guarded optimism. From a low of 30 panthers, we've seen a steady increase in the number of panthers on the landscape. And it's a testament to the support of so many people and the hard work of so many people, including all of you who care so much about panthers. Our foundation has contributed over the last 3 or 4 years, thanks in part to your contributions and principal funders like the Knopf Family Foundation in Connecticut and Massachusetts, about $500,000 to panthers. Everything from supporting FWC and providing the money needed for a cryogenic freezer so that blood and tissue samples can be saved for a long term, which become very important when it comes to thinking about disease and genetics of panthers. We've also recently helped FWC upgrade its X-ray equipment that can be used in the field to more immediately assess the causes of panther mortality. In an injured panther, look for broken bones, etc., to try to increase the odds of their survival. We've also worked with Zoo Tampa in Lowry Park, which is one of 2 authorized panther rehabilitation centers in the state, and have helped them with expansion of their facility there. And most recently, and a lot of the conversation today will concern feline leukomyelopathy, and take Hollis's pronunciation better than mine, but FLM as it's known, which is the disorder that's affecting the hind limbs of both panthers and bobcats in the state. So again, thank you all for contributing to that. Many other people contribute by purchasing the Conserve Florida Wildlife license plate, all the proceeds of which come to us, and also the Florida Panther plate itself, and the proceeds go directly to FWC and its Panther program. And we have, and Michelle made sure I talked about this, we have plush panthers that sort of our Adopt a Panther program. Michelle's going to hold up our little plush panther, which are available on our website for $35, and that goes to supporting these types of programs as well. And so a lot of things we do, from the hokey to the serious. But at any event, that's us, where we are right now, and I'll turn it over to the people who can speak in depth about the Panther situation right now. So Dave or Hollis, whoever wants to start.
Yep, we'll go ahead. We're going to start the presentation. So we're going to try to share our presentation. So you'll have to let me know once everything looks the way it's supposed to. Bear with me. And let me know if you see the presentation without all the words and notes around it.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Okay, we're gonna start. So thanks for that kind introduction. Again, my name's Dave Honorato. I'm one of the panther biologists based out of Naples. And Hollis Stewart is next to me, and she's our panther veterinarian. And we're just going to give a real quick, about 15-minute presentation. This presentation is very similar to the one that was recently given at a commission meeting, but it just kind of give you some quick background information on panthers, and as well as kind of some of the research objectives that we're focusing on today, and where we see things going in the future. So let's go ahead and start out with some background information on our two native cats. You're probably all aware that we have two wild cats in Florida, panthers and bobcats, and they're commonly misidentified as each other, mainly bobcats being called panthers. You can see some general information about their biology: breeding every 2 years. Panthers typically produce 2 to 3 kittens. They're solitary animals, except for those time periods when they're either have kittens tagging along with a female, or they get together to produce more kittens, a male and a female. The home ranges of panthers are very large, and so that's one of the challenges for them in terms of conservation, is you need large areas of habitat in order for panthers to persist. So you can see up to 200 square miles with some of the home ranges of these males. Looking more specifically at the comparison of our two wild felids, these are some good things for folks to keep in mind. It's hard when you haven't seen a lot of these animals in the wild, because of course they're difficult to see. But nonetheless, when you see them side by side, it makes you realize how different they are. And so, we focus on this diagram here, some of the specifics that help us identify one from the other, whether it's just the raw size difference, the height. The big thing, of course, we look for is the tail. You can see when you see a bobcat tail versus a panther tail, there's no difference. The white on the back of the ears of the bobcats, of course, if you're close enough to a panther to see that he doesn't have white on the back of his ears, you're probably pretty close to a panther. So it's not going to happen very often. But again, we just show this to kind of help people with identification of what they may be seeing in their backyard or out in the woods when they encounter one of our wildcats. So historically, panthers range throughout the southeastern United States, from areas of the deep south and all the way through peninsular Florida. But you can see from the map on the right there that today panthers persist on about 5% of that historic range, and it's mainly isolated down in areas south of the Caloosahatchee River. And so by the 1980s, there were probably only about 20 to 30 panthers left in Florida. And so, pretty dire straits for the animals, and inbreeding depression was having a major impact on the remaining panthers and causing all kinds of havoc. And it really looked like they're in this kind of what we call a vortex of extinction. Extinction seemed to be pretty imminent. And so it's at that time when the FWC, federal agencies, academics got together and decided that genetic introgression by the release of 8 female pumas from Texas into South Florida might help alleviate this inbreeding vortex that was being observed in Florida. So people might ask, well, why did you get females from Texas? Well, the main reason is, historically you saw on that map that panthers range throughout the southeastern United States. So historically there was genetic interchange between panthers and other populations of pumas to the west. But as panthers became isolated and the landscape changed and there was more development and they became stuck down in the tip of Florida, there was no opportunities for that genetic interchange with other populations of pumas. And so what we did in 1995 basically mimicked that gene flow that used to happen naturally prior to colonization of the Southeast. So 35 years of data comparing pre-genetic rescue and post-genetic rescue shows that, you know, we've had declines in a lot of these inbreeding correlates that we call them, the infamous kink, the cowlick, male reproductive problems, and then we've seen improvements in heterozygosity. So all those things combined paint a much brighter picture for panthers than we had in the 80s and early 1990s when we only had 20 to 30 of them in South Florida. So today, you know, we estimate that there are probably around 120 to 230 panthers in Florida, and these are adults and subadults. And we continue to use that number at the current time. You know, the trend that we've seen is as the number of panthers that we've counted through this minimum count technique that was used over the years increased, and you can see how it really just kind of started to increase at 1995, the year of genetic introgression, and continued to do so basically up until that count was stopped in 2015. Well, those numbers correlate really well, unfortunately, with the number of road kills. So we've always kind of, you know, used the substantiate that correlation by saying, well, an increase in road kills, it's bad, but at the same time, it's been going up with the population size. And so it's kind of an artifact of one on the other. So I wanted to focus on a couple of the research priorities that we currently have at FWC on Florida panthers. One of them is coming up with some population monitoring techniques that we're looking at using. Some of them we're using now, some of them we're going to try in the future. We'll touch on feline leukomyelopathy that was introduced to you at the beginning of this session. So we refer to it as FLM because it's kind of a mouthful, but we'll talk to you about some of the work we've been doing with that. And then also over the last 2 years, we've been putting some of our focus on panthers in Central Florida. So this is outside of the core breeding range, basically areas north of the Caloosahatchee River to I-4. Just to get a better grasp on the number of panthers that might be up there, and, you know, female panthers, are they there? Is there reproduction occurring outside of the core breeding range south of the Caloosahatchee River? So looking at some of the techniques we've historically used to kind of monitor the population status through a variety of population viability models. We've denoted that adult female survival is a critical demographic parameter that we need to continue to monitor. It's a vital component of understanding how the population is doing. Motor vehicle mortalities, it's kind of a morbid way of looking at trends in the population, but we've done some statistical modeling that allows us to use data from our collared animals and then uncollared road kills to come up with an estimate of the population size. This methodology doesn't give us a very tight fit in terms of the variation within that estimate. So it's not probably the methodology of choice, but it does seem to show us good information in terms of the trends of the population, whether it's stable, increasing, or decreasing. We've used camera traps for a variety of different studies, whether to look at density estimates of panthers on both private and public land. We've had several long-term camera grids out on federal land as well as a private ranch. And so those provided us with some estimates of the number of panthers and density of panthers in those areas. Some things to look at in the future are kind of reassessing how we look at the population size. Of course, everybody for endangered species like panthers wants to have a number, but a genetic effective population size is something we can estimate just by a lot of the data that we already collect, road kills, captures, using the genetic data that we get from them to come up with an idea of the population size from a genetic perspective, and which can be very informative. So that's something we're looking at. And also some newer camera trap model techniques that we've seen in the literature hold promise to provide us with more accurate means of estimating the population size. So estimating the population size of large carnivores is notoriously difficult, just because of the fact of those large areas they roam across. You know, an endangered species, of course, they're very rare and hard to get your hands on. So there's a lot of hurdles to overcome to come up with a population estimate. And so it's something we've definitely struggled with over the years, but we continue to work on that. So feline leukomyelopathy is the disorder that's kind of a focus of a lot of our research right now. This was kind of first documented in 2017 by actually citizen scientists that sent us some videos that got our attention, and subsequently we deployed a lot more cameras to kind of get a grasp on this disorder. It's noted by this hind limb weakness, and it's only seems to be found so far in bobcats and panthers. We haven't seen it in any other footage that we've collected or been sent to us, and we've put out, you know, over 100 cameras throughout portions of South and parts of Central Florida. So that picture kind of gives you an idea of how the animals are impacted. I think this video, if it works, will give you a good perspective as well. You can see here probably about maybe a 5 to 6 month old kitten having some hind legs swaying there as he walks away, but you see a sibling having a much more difficult time moving along the trail to keep up with his family group. And so obviously an animal like that is going to have a really hard time surviving in the long term. You know, panthers depend on capturing large prey, and if you're walking like that, the prospects for long-term survival are pretty poor. So FLM, you know, got our attention pretty quick. And, you know, even though we haven't documented a huge number of cases, you can see here a total of 50. 11 of these are confirmed. The only way you can confirm FLM is via necropsy and looking at the spinal cord. So we've had 3 panthers and 8 bobcats over the past 3.5 years show up positive after they've been necropsied. The probable cases, we come up with those by looking at those videos. If we see those symptoms of the disorder, like I just showed you, and cameras that we've put out or data that's sent to us by collaborators or citizen scientists, we can assess whether that's a probable case of FLM. And so you can see from this map here where the cases are concentrated, of course, in Southwest Florida, where most of our work takes place, but we've also got confirmed and probable cases along the West Coast, all the way up to Gainesville, and even a probable case up in just south of Jacksonville. So we do feel it's a condition that's probably statewide in bobcats and panthers. But at this point, you know, the focus of our research is trying to get a better understanding of what might be the cause, whether it's, you know, human induced through environmental toxins, pesticides. We're kind of throwing the whole kitchen sink at it in terms of trying to get a feel for what may be causing this disorder. And it's just something, you know, we have not only our staff here, our veterinary staff, but also experts throughout the US and even internationally involved with ideas and discussions on ways to try to figure out what is causing this. And Florida Fish and Wildlife, or the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida is, as was stated in the intro, has been a supporter of our research on FLM, and we're certainly very thankful for that. So we will be kind of getting together a bunch of these experts, hopefully next spring, to kind of brainstorm on some of the information we've garnered so far and the tests that we've done, and seeing what else might be suggested moving forward. We are starting to capture bobcats to use as a surrogate for panthers for assessing FLM. Obviously, bobcats are they're easier to handle. There's more of them, so we're more likely to capture a larger sample size to kind of follow them around in these areas that we call so-called hot zones of FLM to see if we can get a better grasp on how the disease progresses, where they're catching, what kind of habitats they're using, where they might be coming into contact with things that could cause this disorder. So, we do plan on catching more bobcats to learn hopefully more about the cause of FLM moving forward. So lastly, in terms of research, just touching on the Central Florida Panther study, you can see here that in 1973, that was the last time a female panther was documented north of the river. Now, since that time, of course, we've gotten reports from multiple sources north of the river stating that they had female panthers or even kittens on their property. But unfortunately, those reports could never be substantiated with evidence in terms of a photograph or track that we could verify as being from a female. So got to the point, though, that FWC wanted to start some informal surveys north of the river. So we started deploying cameras on public lands just north of the Caloosahatchee River, more intensively so in 2016, and then started to get pictures of what we believed was a female, which ultimately was documented and further verified when we saw that animal with kittens. So it was kind of a watershed moment in terms of panther conservation, over 40 years until the time when we saw a female north of the river, never mind a female that had bred and had kittens. So that was a big day for us and everybody that supports panther conservation, because getting the population to naturally expand its range into Central Florida is a key component of recovery of the endangered panther. And so 2019, we kind of set up a more formal camera study to focus on a wider swath of Central Florida. So you can see on the map on the right, 112 cameras spread out from, Babcock Ranch down there in the south, all the way up to areas of Avon Park, up to the north and State Road 60. And so, over the time period where we have data for here, you can see 390 independent panther images. Of course, a lot of those are going to be the same animal because most of the panthers north of the Caloosahatchee River are still male panthers that have come from the south and are kind of roaming around large areas looking for females. Of course, now, fortunately, there are documented at least a few females for them to find. So you can see during this study, we have documented some females. Again, all of them are just north of the river, have been just north of the river in Babcock and Fish Eating Creek areas, which are, if you can see, in this area right here. So good news. I mean, you can see the difference in trap rates. Central Florida versus South Florida are obviously number of panther detections is much higher in South Florida because that's the core panther range. But nonetheless, very good information to kind of give us a grasp on what's going on north of the river. And so this has been really successful and informative research that we've been doing north of the river. So as I mentioned, males are obviously the animals that we document most with cameras north of the Caloosahatchee River. We've consistently been able to document females in Babcock Ranch, Fish Eating Creek. But, a bit of concern for us is, or something of note is the fact that these kittens that have been produced, those 3 litters, we didn't see any evidence, concrete evidence of them actually being recruited into the population. We know that several of those litters probably failed. The reason why is unknown to us. And so no kittens being seen now for about the last almost 3 years. That's our 2 years, sorry. That's, we'd like to see more activity in terms of reproduction up there. And that's why we were, very cautious when we first got confirmation of females and kittens north of the river that it's more than just producing them. They have to actually get recruited into the population. And so hopefully more females will get across and more reproduction will occur moving forward. And this kind of wrap things up. Of course, with any large carnivore, there's always conflict with humans for a variety of reasons. I mentioned at the top the wide areas that they have to roam, and so with more panthers and the areas they need to persist, and obviously a lot more people in Florida, there's more opportunities for conflict, whether it's with in more rural areas with ranchers losing calves to panthers, which we know occurs, or in these more kind of exurban, suburban areas of folks with hobby livestock, which is a big kind of thing down here in Southwest Florida and the Golden Gate Estates. Panthers roam through these areas that still have empty woodlots, and they come across, someone's goats or chickens. And so there is that conflict that occurs. So we've, made a pretty significant effort at outreach to those individuals, put on workshops, social media posts, and we maintain a database of these depredations so we can look for patterns and see if there's any areas where these are occurring more than others. We actually, have a person that's in charge of outreach for panthers that works for our group. So, we've made an effort. It's like I said, it's certainly a challenge. People have different perspectives and feelings about panthers. Some don't like them, some do. So, it's just kind of the way things go when you're working with large carnivores. There's always controversy, and so we try to do our best in terms of reducing conflict and educating people on the best ways to avoid losing livestock when panthers are around. You all are probably really aware of how road mortality is a huge factor on panthers and their recovery, and so it's something that these wildlife underpasses that have been placed on roads in South Florida have definitely played a pivotal role in helping to reduce that, especially along Interstate 75, which runs right through the heart of panther country. If there weren't 50 miles of fencing on there and underpasses every couple of miles, we certainly would have lost a lot more panthers on that road once it became, a federal interstate. So, we work with a variety of groups, other government agencies, to come up with ideas on where might be good places to put underpasses in the future. And so just for one example here, you see this map. This is I-75, where it starts to turn into Alligator Alley, just east of Naples at the toll booth. This is a stretch of highway where we had a lot of road mortalities in the last 15 years. And so it was not fenced. And so I think within the last, it's 3 to 4 years, we worked with these groups that you see here to come up, make the case that this is a stretch of highway that could benefit by having wildlife fencing put up and some underpasses retrofitted for wildlife crossings, not only for panthers, because when you do this, of course, you're benefiting all wildlife. So many species use those underpasses, deer, alligators, raccoons, armadillos, bears, they all use them. So if we're protecting it in the sense of just for panthers, it's really protecting a lot of other species by doing it. And so since that fencing has gone up, obviously it's helped panthers out a lot and all those other species through that kind of danger zone. And lastly, just to note, kind of for those of you that are aware of this panther sightings database that we keep, members of the public are obviously always getting sightings of animals that may or may not be panthers, but they have the opportunity to submit them to this website here. And we have staff that look over those submissions and try to verify whether they are a panther or not. And so you can see, the verified panther images that we've gotten across Florida that have come in since this project started. Well, it's probably been close to 10 years now that we've been doing this. So great way to get citizens involved with panther conservation and get a better grasp of the distribution of the animals. So I'll just wrap up with just some information on where you can get learn more about panthers, submit your sightings, tips if you see, an animal injured on the road or find a dead panther. just by way of example, last Thursday, we got a call from an individual that, according to them, and of course, this certainly does happen, the panther hit her car. They run out, sometimes hit the side of the car. She was kind enough to stop, called FWC. The officer that responded saw the animal kind of limping off into the woods, called us, and Hollis, myself, another biologist, and that law enforcement officer all went out there. And after about 2 hours of trying, we were able to find that cat, dart him, and you know, get him fixed up. And you know, he's still not out of the woods, but certainly there's the potential there for that animal to get released back into the wild if he makes it through his recovery. So always appreciate the public's concern for panthers and giving us those tips on something they might see. And then lastly, and it was presented at the beginning there, on the Panther Project for FWC, almost all of our funding comes from those Protect the Panther license plates that you see out and about. So each year when you renew those, you pay basically what amounts to a $25 donation that goes to FWC for Panther research and management. It goes into the trust fund. So we don't use almost any tax dollars or general revenue on FWC for Panther research. It all comes from citizens that have purchased those tags. And so we're very grateful. It's been a very successful program for it's been almost 30 years, probably it's been ongoing. So certainly appreciate anybody that has those, and welcome new people that want to purchase those tags for their cars, because it's a great way to help Panther conservation. And with that, we'll kind of wrap up, and I'll stop talking, and we'll take some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. We've had a few come through the chat. So I can go ahead and ask those.
Okay. Hopefully you can see us again.
Yeah, do you want to mute just while I ask them so that we don't get the feedback? Thanks. So we had one come in from Mary. She's wondering if collecting tufts of hair on barbed wire fences, for example, can be used to look for genetic variability, population sizes, give you that kind of information.
Yep, that's correct. It can be. That's actually a technique that's used a lot for bear research. They set up barbed wire perimeters around a bait station or a scent station. The bears go in, and when they go in, they have to go under this piece of barbed wire, and it pulls out some hair. And then biologists go in, collect that hair, and then they can identify to the individual, and they also determine the sex of the animal from those hair samples. So we've actually collected hair samples at depredations or off of cars or off of barbed wire fences that we've subsequently been able to amplify the DNA from that. So that's a great question. It's certainly what people refer to as like a non-invasive method of collecting samples for DNA analysis.
Great. And Hollis, maybe you can help answer this next one. Julie is wondering if any other animals get FLM.
For this specific FLM, we're just seeing it in bobcats and panthers. There are other leukomyelopathy. Now my mouth isn't a tongue twister with it. There are other neurologic diseases that also affect the white matter and the spinal cord. In cheetahs, there have been other big cats. If we're talking about big cats, cheetahs have had something similar, but not the same. I believe tigers as well. You're also getting this as a genetic component, and a lot of domestic dogs will have some of these leukomyelopathies, but this one is specific. We kind of named it, but it's specific to just these panthers and bobcats for right now.
Great. And we had a listener want to know if there are any panthers in Putnam County.
I'd have to remember where Putnam County is. I know that's pretty far north. So my answer is no matter where exactly Putnam County is, I'd bring it up if I could fast enough. But I always say that there can be a panther, given their their ability to roam, there can be a panther anywhere in Florida. So I never rule out when we get a call from Leon County or the Panhandle or Putnam County that what the person saw as a panther. Of course, you know, the big thing is getting that evidence to verify it as a panther, which is very difficult. If someone does see one, it's often fleeting. They don't have their camera out. They don't find tracks. So yeah, it's possible that a panther could get up to Putnam County, but the probability is pretty low at this point in time, just given where most of our panthers are. We've had a panther actually go all the way to Georgia, south of Atlanta along the Alabama line, and get killed by a hunter up there. So that just attests to the long distance these animals can travel. So again, Putnam County, that's your answer. It's certainly possible. It's just not very common to happen at this point in time, given how many panthers we have.
Great. There's a question from Bruce wondering about if panthers are going to survive if there's further human development in their territory. Hollis, do you have any thoughts on that, or Dave?
You want to go or? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously a great question. That's habit. When people ask me what's the biggest challenge for panthers, I always say there's three things. It's habitat, habitat, and habitat. So, I mean, it all is going to come down to that. If we can conserve enough habitat for panthers, they're going to persist in the long term. Panthers have persisted for millennia, no matter what we've thrown at them, but they can reach a tipping point. And so, you know, this new Florida wildlife corridor topic that's kind of gained steam and support has the potential to be very beneficial for panther conservation. So, but it's always going to be a topic of discussion for panthers is having enough habitat given the areas they need to roam to survive. So yeah, great question. That's just going to be always the main issue for panthers.
We have another one from Thomas. He says, thank you for the presentation. At one time, the Florida Panther Recovery Plan aimed to establish 3 separate breeding populations across its historic range. Is that still the long-term goal? And does FLM interrupt the pursuit of that goal?
Yeah, so that's in the current recovery plan that's used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I guess I would say at this point in time, yes, that's still an objective of recovery. It's obviously controversial. You know, we don't have states outside of Florida in historic range knocking down our door saying, please send us panthers. And again, that just gets back to the whole kind of controversy that large carnivores bring up when you talk about reintroducing them or releasing them into historic range. So while it is still part of the recovery plan, you know, at this point in time, the best hope for panthers is for range expansion and doing it naturally if possible. So that's, like I say, those females getting north of the river, a big deal, but reproducing and making more that continue that process is vital to that range expansion.
Hollis, Mary has a follow-up to the FLM and other animals questions. She's wondering if they're found in house cats, if house cats can get FLM.
So far, there's been no documentation of this disease in house cats. We're still in touch with a lot of local veterinarians and animal shelters just in case they see something that looks similar, they can contact us, but it hasn't shown up. It's not to say that this might not jump and switch species, but so far it hasn't, but that is of concern.
Great, and we've had a couple people, Hollis, I'm gonna put you on the spot again. We've had a couple people wonder if infected cats can recover from FLM.
Recovery, once the damage is done, it sort of seems to be done. There is a possibility with other large cats, if it was maintained in captivity, that it could be treated and you can kind of get some sort of stability from this. The problem with us is that these cats are in the wild, so we're not really thinking about treating it. We're trying to understand just how it's transmitted, how it's happening, what it is, and things like that. But there is no sort of spontaneous recovery. It just seems to either stay the same or get worse depending on the species.
Liza asked if ranchers are allowed to shoot panthers if they're a threat to their animals. She assumes not, but is this a strange relationship for the panther population?
What's the relationship she's referring to between ranchers and panthers?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you could understand the rancher's perspective of wanting to be able to do that if they see one of their calves actively being killed by a panther. I mean, I'm not law enforcement, so I don't want to tell you the rule of law, but typically that's not something that's permitted when you have a federally protected species. I think typically only the cases where that might be justified if human life is at risk, then it's harder for someone to press charges for that. But yeah, no, that's not to say people aren't shooting panthers. We know it happens from time to time, not pointing out ranchers. It can happen from anybody that wants to do that. So we can't be everywhere. It certainly probably happens. We know it happens. We've documented it. So yeah, but technically my understanding is that's not a justifiable reason to shoot a panther.
Bruce had an additional question. He's asking about the Texas females that were brought over to help diversify the genetic pool. He's wondering why they were removed from the wild.
Yeah, so the Texas females were removed from the wild because when the plan for genetic restoration was set up, they wanted to limit the amount of genetic variation that would be brought into the panther population from Texas. They didn't want to, what you would say, swamp out the Florida genes, if you will. So that's why after a period of time, and that's actually why we released females instead of males, because you can imagine if we release males, it's much harder to document when a male breeds with a female Florida panther. But we're able to actually know when females breed because they have the radio collars on them. They stop moving because they're hanging out the den. And since we're monitoring these 3 times a week, we know when a female's denning, and then we can go in and work up those kittens and assess the genetics of them. So that's why females were chosen. It allowed us to more closely monitor the level of genetic introgression of the Texas genes into Florida. And so when we'd kind of reached that point, that enough Texas genes were in the population, then any of the remaining Texas females, and several of them died while they were out there, et cetera. But the last ones that were left in the wild, by 2003, they had been removed from the population. So all the panthers out and about today are indeed, Florida panthers. None of those Texas females are out in the wild anymore.
We have a question from Andy. He's wondering what official recovery looks like for the panthers. How many populations and number of panthers are needed for them to be considered safe from extinction?
Yeah, so the recovery plan as currently written says to be delisted would require 3 populations in historic range of 240 animals each. So, right now you could say with the high end of our population size that we state for Florida is 230. So we're close to having perhaps 1 population that meets that criteria. So you can see obviously a long way to go before you would reach 3 populations of 240 in historic range. So again, I don't want to lose sight of all the gains we've made though over the past, the Panther Project has been going on since 1981 with FWC, so over 40 years. And so we've made great strides with the help of all our collaborators at the federal level and beyond to get panthers out of that hole they were in with 20 to 30 animals to the point today where we have a much more stable population that, the future looks a lot brighter with those caveats of caution, of course.
Beth is wondering if there was genetic verification on the panther that was found near the Atlanta area that you referenced, Dave.
Yep. That's actually how we identified it as a panther. So at that time, we were still doing our genetic work with the National Cancer Institute up in Maryland and Steve O'Brien's lab. And so they had, of course, 30 some years of genetic data on panthers. And so what they could do is take that sample, run it through an analysis that would show whether it kind of clustered with panthers or other populations of pumas in North America or South American pumas. And indeed, that animal's genetic signature clustered with panthers. So we actually were able to assess that it came a descendant of one of our animals at Ocala-Cucci Slough State Forest, which is kind of in the northern part of the main breeding range. So pretty interesting that we were able to backtrack his genetic signature back to a group of panthers in South Florida. And so that's how it was determined.
Sue's asking a question that feel free to say you guys aren't comfortable to answer, but she's noting the federal government's planning to open the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge to visitors. She wants to know if you guys have any opinions on that move.
Yeah, it's not, the government has to, increase access to areas, or that's kind of something they like to do. It helps appease public, certain stakeholder groups. I'm not going to express my opinion on it. I could just say that from my understanding, obviously there's always concern when something goes completely from being completely restricted, no public access, to having public access. But if they do it and they monitor it correctly, hopefully it's something that can be done that helps maybe get some of these stakeholder groups to be more supportive of panther conservation in the future. So again, not my opinion on it. So I think there's, we'll have to see what happens, but I think that's probably something that's already in the works and on its way to happening.
Terry's asking an interesting question about if thoughts are being given to the impacts of climate change on panther habitat.
It's played into some model work that's been done on panthers and the viability of the population long term. I mean, a lot of the sea level rise that occurs is, of course, more in our, mangrove and coastal areas. So areas that aren't excessively used by panthers, but there's no doubt if sea level rise follows along what some of these models say it will, that will cause the movement of people to areas that are not inundated by water. And so that has the potential to impact panthers. Just the change in the climate in itself, whether it becomes wetter, drier, hotter, all those things have the implications to affect, not just panthers, but other species as well, including ourselves. So yeah, climate change is something certainly of note that we've looked into as it might impact panthers.
Tony's asked a really great question, wondering what, regular people like the folks on the call can do aside from voting and communicating with politicians to help preserve habitat. I know you mentioned the Panther Plate helps fund your work, but is there anything that folks can be doing to help preserve habitat?
Yeah, I mean, really being an advocate, some of those things you said at the beginning, politically, there may be some NGOs that work to preserve land for wildlife. Names are escaping me at the moment, but Sierra Club, those kind of places, I don't want to say for sure, but those kind of places would be ones that might be more involved with directly trying to purchase land to put in conservation. So I would look at, do some research into some of those organizations that you think fit your interests and how it might help not just panthers, but wildlife in general. That's the good thing. That's why we call panthers umbrella species. You protect land for panthers, you're protecting land for so many other species. So it goes just beyond panthers.
We got a question from Bruce about if there's any other hot spots on underpasses and fences that would help. Do you have any? Is that something that folks could help with in advocating for?
Well, usually those kind of decisions are made in coordination with ourselves, other federal agencies, FDOT, and then also some of the NGOs. There's actually a working group that looks at where these roadkills are occurring, and they kind of come up with hot hotspot maps to kind of inform DOT of where they think might be good places for underpasses. And then, if the funding's there and the opportunity arises, or the roads getting, redone, and those are good times for money to be available to try to get these underpasses put in. So I don't know where the latest hotspot is, but obviously, we have those data that we collect on all those road mortalities that help with that analysis when they want to decide what's the next place to put in one of these underpasses.
Hollis, we have a couple of people wondering how and if the Burmese pythons are affecting Florida panthers, particularly kittens.
Oh, I can't really say that I know a lot about the pythons consuming kittens. They're sort of in a lot more of a wetter area in the mangroves and stuff, and the panthers tend to stay in higher grounds, especially when they're denning. So I know there was that one recently that got the deer fawn, and maybe they're concerned about that. But there's been no evidence, I think,
Yeah, that's what we always get asked, the python question. I think they found a bobcat claw in a python. So, it's certainly possible that a python has eaten a panther kitten, but given the fact that there's probably so few panther kittens in comparison to these other species, I don't know. I don't believe it's happening all the time, but certainly that large invasive predator is problematic to the ecosystem, which can eventually affect panthers. So it's a lot of time and money is being spent on by our agency, by the feds, to look into that issue. Unfortunately, cat's out of the bag, and getting it, hopefully trying to get it under control, but removing pythons from the landscape, I think, is not in the foreseeable future.
We got a couple of questions about how the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act might help, if you see that helping the panther population.
Yeah, it's certainly, it could help in terms of that central Florida kind of hopscotching of panthers to the north. Setting aside those areas in perpetuity, hopefully for preservation, would help kind of make that, if you will, corridor from the core population in South Florida to areas that we've shown in models that could support populations of panthers. So getting up into North Florida, like Ocala, Osceola, and then over to the Panhandle area where there's still some great panther habitat, and panthers would do well. A lot more deer up there. Lower population densities for the most part than, the huge densities we have in the South. Getting that interest in that and passage of that is a big deal. And hopefully it'll come to fruition and make that stable corridor for wildlife to move north.
And this is going to be our last question. So if you guys had a question that comes up later or we didn't get to yours today, thank you all for the great questions that we have gotten to. Feel free to respond to the email you got with the Zoom link here, and send me your question. I can make sure we get them answered. Or if you have any other questions about our work or FWC's work, happy to get those questions answered if they weren't answered during our hour today. But I know Hollis and Dave have a lot of work they have to do, so I want to respect their time. So this will be our last one. This is from Debbie. She says she's heard a lot of comments about the fact that Florida panthers are no longer truly a separate species and therefore should not have any special protections due to the Texas cougar genes. She wants to know how you would respond to people who believe that.
Hey, Deb, I thought I saw Debbie Blanco's name up there. So hi, Debbie. It's been a long time. Hope you're doing well. That's obviously an issue that's been wrangled with for a long time. My response to it at this point in time is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service still considers the panther as a distinct subspecies of puma, and they're protected as such. So that said, the science shows in recent years, especially as genetics has begun to play a more prominent role in designation of subspecies versus a time period when panthers were designated as subspecies way back at the beginning of the last century, where they used more things like morphometrics, so shape of the head, shape of the skull, color of the fur, more things that are a little bit more observational as opposed to empirical evidence with genetics. And so what recent studies have shown is that most pumas in North America are likely the same subspecies. And so this is certainly information that the regulatory agency, which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, takes under consideration. And at a point in time where they'll review that, and if they decide that panthers are indeed the same subspecies as other populations of pumas, then there may be associated changes with that. But the bottom line is that panthers can still be identified as such through genetic analyses. So if we get a sample, it's happened before, of an animal, a captive animal that gets out, and then someone claimed, oh, it was a panther, we can run that animals. And we had this happen over on the East Coast. This MMA fighter had a pet cougar. It got out, and nobody knew for sure whether it was wild or it was actually a pet. So we got the sample, sent it to our lab, ran it through our analyses, and it grouped out with panthers from the West Coast. And so we knew right away it was not a panther. And so there is still enough genetic difference between those populations for us to make those kind of analyses work. When you get into the subspecies question, that's where things get a little bit more controversial. And again, the science seems to show that indeed there's likely just one subspecies of puma in North America. So it's one of those hot button issues that probably won't go away until some kind of final decision is made.
Great, thank you. Andy, do you want to close us out?
I will, and let me add a few comments too very quickly. If you're looking for other organizations working actively in this field that Dave was starting to talk about, some of you posted Trust for Public Lands and Nature Conservancy, which would be two good ones. We've also worked closely with Defenders of Wildlife, and they're one of the creators of the Conserve Wildlife tag. And Elizabeth Fleming, who's on this call from Defenders, just put up in the chat room in answer to one of the questions too, where you can go for maps to show where other hotspots are that need to be taken into account as roads get rebuilt, et cetera, to create more wildlife underpasses. Also, the Florida Wildlife Federation, which is a separate organization from the National Wildlife Federation. They do have a person, Meredith Budd, based in Naples. She works quite a bit on land use issues around the panthers, around and within the panthers' critical habitat. And just FYI, the background behind me on my image here is the DeLuca property in Osceola County, about 30 miles north of Okeechobee. And this was the 27,000 acres that was donated to the University of Florida late last year by Elizabeth DeLuca of the Subway restaurant chain. This land was originally slated for to be the core of a city of about 250,000 people in the headwaters, the Everglades, and the DeLuca family has decided instead to give it to the University of Florida for conservation and research on both agriculture, cattle ranching, basically, and how that can occur and does occur in conjunction with preserving iconic species in the Florida landscape. And so we are working with them, as is FWC and others, on a long-term management plan for that property. But it helps connect Kissimmee State Park Preserve and a number of other properties over there. And these are all part of that Florida Wildlife Corridor Plan that now has some serious funding behind it. So I think we have a lot to look forward to in terms of improvement of the range of the Florida panther, both south and north of the Caloosahatchee River. Very quickly, last question, because for Dave and Hollis, because I'm sure there are a lot of aspiring biologists out there in the world who wonder how does one get to the point where you can work with charismatic megafauna and apex predators like Florida panthers, and just like to know how you both got to this point where you've been able to work on these animals that so many people care about.
Well, you have an hour. Yeah, no, for me, it's kind of a long and winding road. So I got my undergrad degree in biology and then ended up really focusing on fisheries, but I always wanted to get involved with large mammals and carnivores specifically. Didn't have the opportunity, did a master's also focusing on freshwater fish. And then after getting my master's, I just got the opportunity to work at a lab in University of Alabama, Birmingham, that was working on collared lemmings. So that's my first mammal experience. And just out of a stroke of luck, applied for a PhD position working on black bears in Big Bend National Park. And I think my professor, as opposed to the way a lot of people go, because carnivore biology certainly has its share of inbreeding itself in terms of scientists. And so he just kind of liked the diverse experience I'd had with fish and turtles and bowerbirds and varied things, that he took a chance and hired me. And then, so that got my foot in the door in the carnivore world. And kind of coming back full circle down to panthers, you know, as a kid coming down to Florida and reading about the panther in the 70s, and then having now the opportunity to actually work with them has just been, you know, it's been, you know, kind of like a dream in that sense. So yeah, hard work, persistence, some things you might have to go to school for longer than others, but, you know, being persistent really pays off in the end. And then the other thing I'd say for young scientists and students is and which I didn't do enough of, is doing internships or getting out there and volunteering for a summer, going to check grizzly bear hair snares in Montana, because that kind of stuff on your CV is going to get your foot in the door. And now I'll let Hollis tell about her side.
Yeah, I agree with Dave completely with the volunteering and internships and things like that. And also, I don't think there's I mean, maybe someone has had a straight path somewhere out there. I definitely have not had a straight path. I did undergraduate. I wasn't even in a major science-y major. I did cultural anthropology because I was quite interested in the human and animal connection, like an historical aspect of just, I don't know, the variety of like tombs and Egyptian, just sort of this connection, this human animal connection really fascinated me early on. I always wanted to be a vet, but that's what I got a little distracted in undergrad, and that interests me. And then I did vet school at University of Georgia, but in between then I had a fair amount of internships and externships. I wasn't specifically honed in on big cats, even though I think now this is where most of my experience comes from, but I was very inspired by Diane Fossey and Jean Goodall, and I really wanted to go into primates until I actually started working with primates. And then I was like, I have no interest in, I like them, but I don't want to work around them or be around them in a captive or wild setting. It wasn't interesting for me, but it was actually at a primates facility where I was volunteering as a vet assistant type thing that they had some captive big cats that kind of got me around large cats. And then I was like, oh, I like these animals. And then being a zoo vet led me to Cheetah Conservation Fund. And that was sort of my first full-time position with cheetahs and big cats. And then sort of had a mix of every other species in between there, and then came back to America's big cat. So I really like cheetah and lions and other animals, but for me, it was kind of meant a lot to work on something that the US considers very precious, and to help preserve and save the habitat and lives of panthers is a good deal.
Good. Well, thank you both very much for your time today, and everyone on this call and your interest. And as Michelle said, you know, send us a message through our website or in other ways if you have any follow-up questions, and we will get them answered. Thank you all. Michelle, back to you.
Thanks.
No, I think that's it. So thanks Dave and Hollis and Andy and everybody for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.